Hello, and thank you for tuning in to this episode of R&R's Ask the Expert. I'm your host, Valerie King, R&R's editor-in-chief, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by Mili Washington, who is Standards Director of the Institute of Inspection, Cleaning, and Restoration Certification, which most of you know is the IICRC. She's been with the IICRC since 2011, and her focus has been to grow IICRC standards while also streamlining the standards development process and strategy. Now, that includes work toward American National Standards Institute approval for new and revised ANSI/IICRC standards, and work toward international adoption of the IICRC standards. This is not Mili's first experience with standards development because in her previous role as manager of standards and guidelines at the American Industrial Hygiene Association, she oversaw the development of several ANSI standards for the occupational health and safety profession. And Mili is a member of the Society for Standards Professionals and currently serves on the SES Board of Directors as past president. She is officially certified by the SES as a certified standards professional. So you get the theme. Standards is her area of expertise, IICRC and beyond. So back to the IICRC. It's, of course, a key resource not only for training and certification, which we think about so often, but standards that bolster consistency, professionalism, and accountability among cleaning and restoration professionals. So that's why we invited Mili on to really give us that 101 or behind the scenes view, if you will, of standards, significance, and really creation and implementation. So we'll also cover toward the end IICRC standards updates, including new ones in the works. Thank you so much for joining me, Mili.
Thank you for having me, Valerie, and also for the very important work that you do for the industry. I have always enjoyed our talks, and I'm really looking forward to today to providing an overview of IICRC standards, what we do, why we do it, and also hopefully a little glimpse into where we see ourselves in the future.
Love that. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you. Okay, so first, could you clarify for us your role with the IICRC as Standards Director, your main goals and your main areas of focus?
Absolutely. As you mentioned, Valerie, I've been with the IICRC for over a decade now. When I first started, my priorities were mostly around retaining our standards status, as an ANSI accredited standards developer. It was more focused on the operational everyday type focus. Our goals were more towards improving and streamlining procedures for standards development. Now, though, it's a little more shifted to being more strategic and growth opportunities, harmonizing our efforts, both internally, among our standards and guides, and then externally with industry partners, stakeholders, and even international standard setting bodies. My role is, simply put, cat herder, but it's really to provide oversight, guidance, and expertise in the process of developing an American national standard and assisting our volunteer base. We have over 170 volunteer members who work on our different standards. And my focus is to make sure that they have all the tools that they need to make sure that we retain our ANSI accreditation, and we continue to grow our standards, at IICRC and within the industry. So there's a lot there. Simply put, cat herder.
I love that. Okay, so why? Why does the IICRC do this work and develop industry standards?
I think, the way I see it is an industry without standards is an industry that does not have any written guidance whatsoever. And for the cleaning, restoration, and inspection industries, the IICRC is the go-to, is the standards developer, is the ANSI accredited body that writes standards. And why do we do this? it's a really rigorous process that is labor intensive, but the outcome, what we end up with in the end is well worth the effort, right? So standards promote health and safety. They promote environmental safety, environmental sustainability, economic efficiency, which I think is pretty much at the core of a lot of companies and businesses, is that bottom line, right? Standards impact that, and that keeps it at a lower level than if we didn't have standards. We also are able to explore potential for new standard solutions by doing research. Our standards provide the basis for education, for certification, right? So our guides provide accurate application for workspaces and for communities. And then lastly, advocacy. Standards drive public awareness, the promotion of standards and engaging a new generation of standards users and developers. So the answer is very broad, but really it's to provide guidance to the industry and fill those gaps that existed prior to standards being written and published.
Thank you. So, what is an IICRC standard in layman's terms? Really, what does it look like and encompass?
That's a big question, Valerie.
Uh-oh.
So I'm going to break it down, and I think what I'll do is explain really what a standard is, right? Because it's a document. Everyone understands that. How is it different from regulation? How is it different from, say, a guidance document, right? So a standard is an agreed upon way of doing things. So in other words, some predetermined criteria for a given situation. And for us, it's cleaning, it's inspection, it's hard surface related standards. Our standards represent that agreed upon norm or guide to helping our daily lives and helping us make more informed decisions as companies, as restorers, as remediation workers, and as inspectors. So standards on their own, they're not good or bad. They just provide that information, right? They provide information to the industry for then technicians and practitioners to follow that standard of care, which is really, as we define it, the standard of care, or what is included in our standards, is common practice among the prudent professional, someone who is qualified as a professional in the industry, already should be doing these things. So what we're doing is we're taking that information, putting it together in a standard, publishing it so that there is that document, not only for the industry to fall back on, but for the legal community, for the insurance community to have that basis for referencing a standard. Now, interestingly, our standards are voluntary consensus-based standards. What does that mean? That means that there is no regulation per se. This is not law. What we write is not law. It's a standard, but it does stand up in court. What that means is, if one is in this industry but not following one of our standards or what is outlined in a standard, then one can be held liable. And so therefore, the standards are super important. They cover the required standard of care, what should be done by, as I mentioned, a prudent professional, a qualified and prudent professional in the industry. And so, our goal is always to make sure that where there is a gap and it's important to have a standard, that we put together experts, which are stakeholders, materially interested parties. They come together, they collaborate, they cooperate, and put together a standard. So IICRC, in other words, is sort of hosting the party, but we're not writing the standard. It's the experts that are coming in and writing the standard. We provide all the tools that they need, and we publish the standard for the industry.
Thank you. Really helpful, and bringing to life even more the importance and value of them, also like the stakeholders beyond restoration and cleaning, how this compares to something legal but how it holds up legally. So a lot of value there. I did want to ask another layered question just on a super practical note. Where are the standards? Where can I find them if I'm in the industry?
You can purchase an IICRC standard through IICRC, through our web store, and also through ANSI. ANSI as well sells, and we have some other third-party sellers as well. But really the best place is IICRC web store. We have all of our standards available there, current and historical. But then we also have, which I think is really the best product that we offer in standards, and that's our subscription. So the subscription is an online subscription. It's an annual subscription that provides a subscriber access to all of our standards, current standards, historical standards, pretty much anything that's ever been written, as well as videos and tutorials. When a standard comes out, we'll put out some information on, what to expect, what changed, things like that. So the standard subscription is really the best value, and you get everything in one shot. So IICRC is the source for all standards.
That's great to know. And also that there is that subscription model available that makes it all, puts it all in the hands of professionals. Okay, so accreditation, ANSI accreditation, what does that mean and why is that important?
Good question. Okay, Valerie.
Another big question, maybe?
Yes, it's always, yeah, so we, IICRC, we've been writing standards since the 80s. The first published standard was in 1991. And at that time, though, the standards were written just as IICRC documents. And then back in September of 2005 is when we received accreditation from ANSI. So 2005 onwards, we've been doing standards the ANSI way. Why is it important? It's important because, the requirements that ANSI has. So ANSI has certain essential requirements, and it has certain basic tenets that we must follow to write standards. And those include things like openness. So our standards have to be written in an open and transparent way. We have to notify folks when we are intending to develop a new standard, revise a standard, withdraw a standard. So any action on a standard that is either an American national standard or is a proposed American national standard, we have a requirement to provide notification on anything that happens with the standard to all stakeholders. We have to maintain balance and a lack of dominance on our committees. What that means is we have to have really good stakeholder participation. What does that mean? So any industry typically has some users of a standard, people who would purchase the standard and use it, and then producers, which is someone who produces the service. For our industry, it's really a service, right? So it's restoration, it's cleaning, those are the services. So if someone is producing, then they would be categorized as a producer. And then those who don't fall into the user or producer category would be general interest. So we are always striving to maintain a balance of those interest categories of user, producer, excuse me, and general interest. We have to ensure that there's due process, which means that if someone is dissatisfied or is an unresolved objector, then we must address their concerns. We must give them the right to appeal, and we must, do the whole jumping through all the hoops before we can publish a standard. So, and then at the crux of the whole process is this idea of consensus, right? So our standards are consensus based, which means most of the folks that are participating on the standards development must agree with the content. Not everybody necessarily, although we try to make sure we have 100% approval. But those are, the openness, the balance, the lack of dominance, notification, providing due process, making sure there's an appeals process, and then basing everything off of consensus. Those are some of the basic tenets that ANSI requires. And I will tell you, not always easy to follow every single one of those, to check every box and to maintain that accreditation. But on the flip side, what we end up with because of this rigor is really an industry document. There has been buy-in, right? We've had experts and stakeholders participate from the day that the standard is initiated. We have folks weighing in when we have public review, which means you can review a document and provide comments, and each comment that is submitted will receive a response, right? So there are a lot of checks and balances in place with the ANSI process. And as painstaking as it can be, the outcome, the published American National Standard, is so much better because it hasn't been written in a vacuum. It hasn't been written by a group of experts and then published. There have been a lot of steps in the process that ensure that we get input and that we tweak the standard and we make changes and we modify it. And in some cases, we put it out for a second or third round of public review. So I think that's really what it's about. The reason why it's important is because there is nothing that is equal to an ANSI standard in the US. It's well worth the effort that we put into it to maintain our accreditation, and we certainly intend to continue to do so.
Yes, painstaking, rigorous, all of those things. I can only imagine. But to your point, better in the end. And I think that's so important for people to understand who may not have just how much goes into this and how open it is to input in the steps then taken when someone isn't in alignment. Very impressive. Okay, so
I think so.
how, yeah, I'm impressed. So, how should a cleaning and restoration contractor make use of a standard? What should we do, or what should they do with them?
Well, I'd say, first of all, is an understanding of why standards must be used, right? Without using the industry standards, essentially, a company can get edged out of their market share, right? Standards do help, as I mentioned, streamline processes and reduce the costs involved for an individual company, technician, or practitioner. And they help a company become more efficient and more attractive to their customers, right? Because they follow the industry standards. So I would say that participation in standards and using standards gives companies a competitive advantage. It gives them a competitive edge. And if they're not using the standards, then they're losing out their market share to another company or a competitor who is. The using of the standards really is, it's got to be depending on what work the company specializes in or focuses in. One should have available a copy of the standard in whatever format, and there should be training within the company to ensure that the technicians understand what the standard covers and what the requirements are based on the standard. And in some cases, there are certifications that IICRC provides based on our standards. And so that's really a helpful way to learn what the standard talks about and, have that badge of honor of the certification, which really translates to following standards, translates to having training and having expertise in the industry. So in our opinion, participation in standards development and using standards should really be a strategic priority for all companies that are looking to succeed, whether it's in their regional markets or in the global market. Our standards are followed really around the world.
Thank you. Okay, you talked about the building of a standard a little bit there. So let's dig into that. This may be the biggest of the questions. So, behind the scenes view, I'm really curious what does go into creating a new standard from the very first point of introduction to final publication. Maybe we break it into three parts. First, starting with the key stakeholders involved in standards creation, development.
Yeah, absolutely. I mentioned the users, producers, general interest. We spend months putting together a committee for any standard. I mean, of course, there's the approval process. The IICRC Board of Directors must approve the development or the initiation of a new standard. We usually will look at things like, is there a gap in the industry that we need to fill with developing a new standard? Is there, some basic level of return on investment, and do we have the right people to initiate this? As I mentioned, we spend months putting together committees. We spend a lot of effort reaching out to industry partners, to providing notification and announcements of when we're starting a new standard, because it's really important to us to have the right people at the table. I will say in the last 10 years or so, we haven't turned away any applicants. Now I must I must say that not everyone ends up as a voting member, but we have a voting list and a non-voting list. And so that kind of helps us to have, a backup, right? A list of experts that we can reach out to when we need to. Sometimes it's only on a particular topic, but it's an ongoing thing. We focus on it in the beginning, and then we're constantly tweaking and making sure that we maintain balance on our committees.
Very helpful. Okay, now on to the process a little more. What does that entail? At least the key steps or milestones.
Absolutely. This is my life, right? So I'm going to summarize my life in about a minute or two, Valerie. Essentially, so once we have our committees together, right? So we have the committee of voting members and non-voting members. They start the job of putting together an outline of a standard and then putting together the draft of the standard. That's really the bulk of the work. That's the heavy lifting. That's where, we have, say, 10 to 17 sections. I'm just giving examples, right? So say a standard has 17 sections, and we have committee members working on each of these individual sections. They'll work on outlines, they'll work on drafts, then the drafts will be reviewed, tweaked, updated, and that can happen a couple of times. There may be more changes, and nothing's written in stone till a standard is published. And so it's just sort of this metamorphosis. You see the initial draft, and then you see the final. You're like, oh wow, I'm so glad that it changed such a lot. But that's step one, is the drafting of the standard, which can take a long time. It can take several months to a couple of years, especially if it's a new standard and not, a revision. Once the draft is ready, we then put it out for public review, which means anyone that has an interest, any stakeholder can download a copy of the standard, the draft standard, review it, and submit comments. So they can submit one comment, or they can submit 250 comments. It's our responsibility then, the committee's responsibility, to review each comment, address the comment, make changes as necessary based on the comment, and then send responses to the individual commenters. And there are times that we receive, like I said, thousands of comments in one public review session, and therefore it can take time. And it's also hard to predict how long, because there are times when we'll have one round of public review, which is a 45-day period. And there are times when we'll have multiple rounds of public review. So as you can imagine, that delays the whole process of completing the standard and then publishing the standard. So say we're done with our public reviews, right? Say we've had 2 rounds of public review for a standard. We've addressed all the comments that came in. Everyone has received a response, and everyone is satisfied with the response. That's important too. If they're not satisfied, then they are designated as an unresolved objector, in which case we give them the right to appeal, which they can take that right or decide it's not worth it. There are times that has happened. It is not something that we look forward to, shall we say. So we make every effort to ensure that, the comments are addressed really thoughtfully and respectfully, and that we make changes and we accept that feedback from the industry in the spirit it was meant. It is meant to improve the standard. And so if we look at it in that way, then we end up with a better product. And we also end up with commenters who are satisfied, because as a committee, we've made every effort to address their concerns. So we're now at a point where we have no unresolved objectors. We have a draft that is in pretty good shape. We then also have a committee approval ballot. So that's the final approval ballot. Even though the committee has been working on it, there's this formal process of approving and voting on the standard. And once that's done, we're getting close to the end. We're getting close. We're getting there. Once that's done, we do a legal review. We do another round of professional edit. We make sure that there are no, issues with the standard, the formatting, the editing, all of that. And then it gets submitted to ANSI. The paperwork gets submitted to ANSI for approval, which usually takes a few weeks, following which, ta-da, publication, right? Wow. So that's the finish line, and it's well worth it. I mean, it's the highlight, I think, for anybody that is involved with standards development.
That is quite the process. I can imagine for many involved in each standard, that finish line ends with some serious celebration.
It should, yeah.
It should, yes. Okay, so you alluded to this. It sounds like, my next question was, what is the timeline for this? How long does it take? Sounds like there isn't a set one and it's not normally a short process, but could you speak a little more directly to the timeline for a standard
Sure,
being
sure.
developed?
As I mentioned, the application process in itself is several months long because we want to make sure that anyone who has an interest gets a chance to hear about it and apply. Once that's done and the committee gets started, it varies. So it depends on whether the standard is a brand new standard in the industry, which is being, written from scratch, or if it already exists and it's being revised. So ANSI has a requirement that every American national standard must be revised or reaffirmed on a 5-year cycle basis. So if it's a brand new standard, it could take a little longer than if it's a revision. I am intentionally not giving specifics, but if I had to put numbers, I would say, 2 to 3 years for a brand new standard and possibly a year to two for a revision. And it depends on the number of public review rounds we have, the number of concerns that may be expressed, and the changes that need to be made to the standard. So it's really an educated guess anytime I'm saying when a standard will be published. But we are optimists. I think all of us in standards development are optimists, otherwise we would not be doing this. And so the hope is always, we're getting there, it's super close.
Thank you. Okay, so on that optimism level, curious, what do you most enjoy about creating a new standard? You have no shortage of experience in this world, so would love to hear that.
So I would say it's twofold. I think the more important part of what I enjoy is just my work with our volunteers, our volunteer leaders, our volunteer members. This is not a quick process, right? Standards take patience, and it's a multi-year project usually. And so, you get to know each other professionally, a little bit personally, you get to be friends, and you get to understand a lot of the reasoning and, people, right? It's about people. It's about those relationships with our volunteer members, and they're a fantastic group. I can't say enough amazing things about them. We have a great group of leaders in standards development at IICRC, and I'm honored that I get to work with them on a daily basis. The passion, the drive, and the hard work that they put behind it is second to none. So to me, that's the highlight. It's the reason why I do this, and it's what I enjoy the most. And then the second, I think, is it's the publication. When a standard's done and we can announce it, that's a rush. That's really a great time. And I think we need to be doing more celebrating, to your point, Valerie.
Yes, it sounds like that's well earned now that I've learned so much more about this process. So rigorous. So, flip side of that, maybe, what would you say are the
Yeah.
biggest challenges associated with creating a new standard?
um yeah, how much time do you have, Valerie?
You've probably answered that question in a few ways at this point, but yeah,
Yeah,
doubling down on that.
absolutely. So there are a few. To me, some of the challenges are time to publication, right? I wish there was a way to speed track this, especially for things or topic areas where there's really a need in the industry, and we wish that we could somehow put something out there. When the pandemic hit, we wanted to put something out there, and we did, but in a different way. It wasn't a standard. It was a joint white paper and some information that we were able to put out. But I wish that there was a way to speed track standards development. And there are some ideas around that, but that's certainly a challenge, is that time to publication. Despite our best efforts, the ANSI process takes time. That rigor, that that multiple levels of checks and balances, it just takes time. And when you speed it up, I think you lose some of the quality in the process. So that's one. I think another one that we are currently working to address is harmonizing our efforts among our different standards. So we have different consensus bodies writing standards, and we want to make sure that when our customers are reading the standard, they all read with one voice, and that there's no conflict or contradiction among our standards. And sometimes that can be challenging, so that's something that we're working on. We have some joint efforts among standards to minimize that. Um, and then I think there are so many challenges, honestly, but I think the last one that I want to mention is, that we're doing it for the right reason, and that we continue to do that, we're strategizing our standards development, and that we are just sort of ensuring that we're not just writing standards for the sake of writing standards, but being thoughtful about what standards we take on and why.
Very helpful. So, backing it up or forwarding it up a bit, but just a broader lens, I understand that standards and the approaches to bringing them to life are always evolving, and that's a part of what you've been focused on over the years. Could you summarize a little bit the evolution of IICRC standards, at least during your time with the IICRC, really key ways or the strategy behind them, how that's changed or improved over the years?
I think, we've grown with IICRC standards. We had just a couple when we started off back in the 90s, and we have well over 20 at this time. And I think what has really changed is our comfort level. We've been able to settle in as the standards developer for the industry, whereas 20 years ago or 15 years ago, even when I joined 11 years ago, it was a bit of a struggle. There was a bit of a struggle to retain our ANSI accreditation. There was a time when we lost a couple of our standards accreditation, and that was crushing, to those who worked on it, to those who were behind the scenes. It was just too much to take. But now I think we're just in such a good place. We're in a comfortable place. We know what we're doing, and we know that we can do it well. And the advantage of that mostly is that we're able to attract the best and brightest minds in the industry. To have that reputation and credibility in the industry is a luxury, one that we don't take lightly. We work very hard towards it. But to have the right people clamor to be on a standards committee that's wonderful. I think we're in a good place, and the only place from here is higher, right? Better and higher. So I think we're in good shape. We're going to continue to grow our standards. We're going to continue to work hard. I don't think any of this has come easy. There have been hundreds of volunteers, and I don't know how many volunteer hours, thousands and thousands of volunteer hours behind our standards. And so we don't take it lightly. And, we appreciate all that everybody does in the industry. This is an industry with tremendous passion. And I think with the expertise that we have available to us, onward and higher and better and bigger.
That's so great. Okay, so more on that. What is next? What would you say are your top goals for IICRC standards looking ahead?
I think I've mentioned a few of them, but I'd say interoperability and harmonization, that's key. We've got to make sure that we partner with other organizations, that we work towards what's good for the industry and focus on that. We want to make sure that if there are already a dozen standards out there, that we don't write the 13th standard, but that we find ways to harmonize our efforts, and that we find ways to work with other partners and other organizations in the industry. That's important to us. Strategic and intentional growth. I think I've mentioned that, that we need to be continuing to identify areas where there are gaps in the industry in a strategic way, and not just doing standards for the sake of doing standards. Something to consider for us is not everything needs to look like a standard. We could be doing more technical papers, white papers, webinars, position statements, even being inspired by you, what you do, how you do it. Information can be conveyed in many different formats, and we want to make sure that we're being forward thinking in how we put out content, and the frequency, right? Everything does not have to look like a massive standard. It can be put out in bite-sized pieces as well.
That's really helpful perspective. I'm excited by that. You guys are putting a lot of thought into this.
Thank you, Valerie. Yeah, It'll be a process, and we have, our demographic is very varied. And so we want to make sure that we're not only catering to those who are in the industry now, but those who will join the industry. And it should be attractive and easy for them to do that. So that's important. I think, the other couple of things are just maintaining our ANSI accreditation. We know that it is important, and we want to continue to attract industry experts to participate and engage in our standards. And then I also hope that to some extent, that we can promote our standards internationally, the use of our standards as they are internationally, and also, this idea of national adoption. So a standard can be adopted in another country, and we're working on that for a couple of our standards. And those are important things. That's when we're working towards harmonization. We don't need another standard when it already exists. Maybe it needs to be tweaked, but so those are things that we're looking at. So lots of goals, some lofty, some not. But if you don't dream big, I don't know, what are you gonna reach for? So
That's great. Yeah, to your point earlier, very strategically minded. So that's exciting. Um, Before we go, of course, I must ask if you can update us on IICRC standards, but we'll leave it to highlights. I'm sure you could go on. So, curious what stands out in your mind in terms of IICRC standards today and through the lens of updates.
sure. And yes, I will stick with only the highlights. So, because in the interest of time, let's see, we have about 21 proposed American national standards. They're in different stages of development. Or some have just been published, and so that 5-year cycle we'll look at revising and republishing them. We're also working on a couple of field guides. So we have safety and health field guides for the cleaners, for the professional cleaners, as well as the professional restorers. So that does not fall under the ANSI umbrella per se, but we have followed the ANSI process in developing it. And so we're hoping that our cleaners field guide will have gone through the whole process and be published sometime this year. A great committee led by Lee Center and Ryan Tassovac. We're looking to have that published and really be an important resource for all of our standards and for the industry as well. We also have, I should mention, a couple of draft fire restoration standards. We have the S700 and the S760. So the 700 is a more general professional fire and smoke damage restoration standard, whereas the 760 is focused more on wildfire restoration. And so those are two standards that are well into the drafting process, and we hope that we'll be marching towards public review fairly quickly for them. We're excited about the fire standards. It certainly is a gap in the industry. I get a lot of inquiries for that. And so, that's something that we're really looking forward to publishing. We have the S400, which is professional cleaning, maintenance, restoration of the commercial built environment. And that's something that we have never done. It's sort of a overarching cleaning document, which covers the principles, methods, and processes to clean the built environment. So that's something that was non-existent in the industry as a standard. So we're working on that. We also have the S410, which is in some ways a response to the pandemic, but it includes a lot more. It's the standard for infection control during professional cleaning, maintenance of the built environment. So those are some of our newer standards. Of course, we have the 500, which is professional water damage restoration, which was just republished in 2021. The 520, which is mold remediation, that standard we hope to have out for public review this year, and fingers, toes, and eyes crossed to have it published sometime next year, maybe even sooner. I hope I'm wrong with all my predictions. I hope they beat me. We also recently published our very first hard surface standard, the S220, as an ANSI standard. And the 220 is for professional inspection of hard surface floor coverings. We're working on so many cool standards. I mean, the list is long. Okay, so we have a contents remediation standard that we just started. That's our baby, the newest one. And we're excited about that. It's assessment, cleaning, and restoration of contents. We have an HVAC standard, which is, putting together the sort of the HVAC assessment following fire, water, or mold damage events. So it pulls from the 500, from the 520, as well as our new fire standards. We have indoor environmental assessment for suspected mold contaminated structures, which is the 530. So some of these standards that I'm mentioning now are newer standards that are currently in development. Now, and I could go on, but in the interest of time, what I will say is that information on each of our individual standards, what they cover and where we are in that process of development is on the IICRC Standards website. We also provide notification when a standard is available for public review. So if that's something that you're interested in or looking for, I'm usually the person to provide that information, but the IICRC website always has up-to-date information. We put out press releases and notifications. Our goal is to find you and reach you and let you know that something is available for public review. So, many standards, there's a lot of balls that we're juggling at any given time. And it's really, a robust mechanism. As I mentioned, so many of our volunteer members are working towards this, and we expect at least 2 to 3 standards to be out for public review this year. We are also at the moment accepting applications for a proposed new standard, the 340, which is a standard for professional cleaning and maintenance of leather furnishings. So if that's something, that we've been wanting to do that for a while. It's covered minimally in the S100, which is the carpet cleaning standard, but we want to make sure that that is captured. And so we're looking for volunteers, for applicants. Again, that information is on the website, and there is an online application form for anyone who may be interested.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And to think that the list goes on. I mean, really impressive that to know, I mean, I've learned so much here, to know how much rigor goes into one standard and then to realize how many standards you all are working on, not to mention non-official standards, content and information you're working on. It's very impressive. And I do want to highlight that, yes, go to the IICRC website, and also R&R is always happy partnering with the IICRC to share those announcements. So stay tuned as these different standards move forward with key milestones from beginning to end. That was really helpful. Okay, so finally, I want to ask, how can those who are interested in being involved in this IICRC standards development process get involved? What should they do? What should they know?
An application will get you, that through that initial process, right? So we're not always accepting applications for our standards. It depends on where we are in the development process. If we're halfway through or close to the end, we're not usually accepting applications because we've already had a committee that's been working on it. But we give any stakeholders several months to apply for a new standard. As I mentioned, the only one that we are currently accepting applications for is the leather furnishing standards, the 340, and that link is on the website. And I must say a big, huge thank you to R&R and other industry magazines and outlets that always pick up our information and help us to share that, because our goal is to put it out there. Our goal is to have folks involved. It's a very popular standards saying that if you're not at the table, you may be on the menu. And that couldn't be more true. Participation at some level gives you a say. It gives you it gives you a vote if you're a voting member. And if you're just simply reviewing and commenting on a standard, we have an obligation to respond to that. And so it is an opportunity to have a say and have a voice into the content and the quality of the standard. And so we invite a broad range of stakeholders. We naturally cannot take on everyone, But to some extent, in some way or the other, we try to incorporate anyone that has an interest in serving on standards.
Thank you for that. All right, that ends my list of questions. But is there anything else that you wanted to share before we sign off?
No, I just want to say thank you, Valerie. This has been fun. It can be a dry topic, but it's one that's really near and dear to so many in the industry. And I think, us working together to get this information out is invaluable. So thank you for doing what you do. And this has been fun. And I was happy to do it.
Thank you for joining me, Mili. I have learned a ton, and I hope that is the case for our listeners and viewers. I'm sure it will be. To your point, this is what some may think of as a dry topic, but it's so important. And I think this really enlightened me, at least, on how important it is, how valuable it is, and how transparent and thorough it is. And that there's
We
so much
try.
to come. There's so much to
Yeah.
come. So very
Yeah.
exciting times.
And
Um,
I do want to say something since you mentioned transparent and thorough. We really try our level best to be that way, to not be excluding and being sort of insular in the way that we do standards. We want to see new people. We want to hear your ideas and new ways of doing things and thinking about it. And so we really, really encourage participation. We really, if you've never tried being on a standard, give it a shot. I think you might enjoy it. It's really an experience. It's a learning experience because you are learning from your peers and contributing in ways that you may not have. And so it really is a valuable experience. And I'm sharing that on behalf of our volunteer members who are, some of them are on multiple committees because they can't get enough. I think they're masochists, but they enjoy it. So just an invitation.
That's so great to hear. Okay, I do actually have one more question. And of course, that's where can listeners go to connect with you or to learn more about IICRC standards?
Okay, absolutely. So first of all, our website is the one-stop shop for everything IICRC standards. It's iicrc.org/IICRC standards. There's always information on what we do, how we do, and what's coming up next. Individual standards updates are available there. If you have questions about IICRC standards, the best email is standards@iicrcnet.org. And we're happy to answer questions or receive comments or feedback from that email. And then our web store, which is where you can purchase the IICRC standards, is that link is simply webstore.iicrc.org. And that also includes the subscription that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you so much, Mili. That wraps it up. I really appreciate this. I've learned a lot, and I think it's been a really informative interview.
Thank you, Valerie. Same here. Fun.
Perfect. Perfect. All right, listeners and viewers, for more insights on restoration, remediation, and of course the people behind it all, visit our website, randrmagonline.com, also Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. If you haven't yet, be sure to follow the podcast to keep up with all of our latest episodes. And if you could give us a quick review and rating, we would super appreciate it. We are also on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook, so we invite you to follow us on social as well. This has been R&R's Ask the Expert. Thank you for listening.